Today I'm going to be teaching you how to grow onions. You can grow onions by seed or from onion sets. Now there is a bit of a risk when you're using the onion sets just because they're usually about a year old. And because of this, they're more prone to bolting when you plant them, which basically means possibility of maturing faster and going to seed instead of forming a large round bulb of the onion that you would want to eat. I'm going to be planting from both seeds and from onion sets to show you guys the two different ways of doing it, and because one of my coworkers uses the onion sets that we sell at the farm store that we work at, and he's had really good success with these, so I figured I'd give them a try. But for the most part, I have been using seeds, and they've worked really well for me too. You can grow onions directly in the ground if you till it up nice and deep and make the ground really fluffy. I prefer to use raised beds because where I live, there's tons and tons of rocks in the soil, and that makes it really hard to grow root crops because then you won't be able to go as deep in the soil, and then that could stunt their growth, or it could make them grow in like all kinds of weird shapes. So if you're going to use the raised beds, you want to get some nice potting soil. You could mix in some sand to make it nice and light and fluffy, which is really good for any kind of root crop you're growing. That way, if the soil is nice and light and fluffy, it'll give the root plenty of room to grow down and grow as big and wide as it can. I also added some compost in here. I used some compost from the chicken manure because I have chickens. And I also used some ocean blend compost. It's a compost made out of shrimp. Their shells are high in calcium, so that's really good because calcium helps with growth. For the onion sets, you want to plant them this way. You can see right here where the little roots are. You want that on the bottom, and you want the pointy end on top. And you want to put them at least 2 inches down into the soil. And you want to space them out about 2 to 6 inches apart. I usually don't put them quite as close as 2 inches. I know some people do, but I like to give mine plenty of space to grow and fill out. Onions are very heavy feeders, so make sure you put some fertilizer in here as well as the compost that we talked about earlier. I used a 19 fertilizer. Here it is. It's not the prettiest bag. I had this left over from last year, so it's a little bit dirty because it's been sitting in the shed for a while, but it was nice and closed up so the fertilizer stayed dry, so it's going to work just fine. But the number on the fertilizer bag stands for the macronutrients, the major micronutrients. So the nitrogen is the first number always, phosphorus is the second one, and potassium or potash is the last one. Nitrogen helps with growth, and onions really like a lot of nitrogen, and it'll help them fill out into a nice large bulb for you. Phosphorus is really good for root development, so that's another important one for onions because obviously it's a root crop. And then potassium, in short, is basically just like an all-around really good macronutrient for the plant that'll help with overall health and strength. Remember that plants are alive and they need to be fed just like all living creatures need to be fed. So don't think that you should skip out on the fertilizer just to save money because you will not get as good results if you're not using a good fertilizer and good compost. I'm also going to mix in some blood meal, which is a really good source of nitrogen. This is certified organic, which honestly I'm not too worried about that, but if that's something that you're into, keep this in mind. But I like it because, like I said, it gives them a lot of nitrogen. I've had good results with this. And I've heard a lot of people say that if you use this because of the smell, which is really not that bad, but since animals have a better sense of smell than us, it can help deter some pests from digging in your garden. And we have a lot of rabbits around here, so I like to mix this into my raised beds for the plants that need a lot of nitrogen to try to help keep the rabbits from digging in there. It's slow release, so this will feed your plants for a good amount of time. I'm also going to mix in some phosphorus. This is also slow release and it'll feed your plants for a long time. It's really good for bulbs like onions. Good source of phosphorus and calcium. This is also a good one for tomatoes, by the way, but we'll have a whole session on that when the time comes. There's the number on the bag. So we also mix this into the soil along with the 19 fertilizer. And it's funny because the smell of this one always kind of reminds me of seashells. So this is how it looked earlier when I mixed in the bone meal and the blood meal. You can see that the bone meal is white and the blood meal is kind of hard to see in the dirt, but it's the much darker one. So you just mix that in. Try to mix it as evenly as possible. Alright, so the red onions are planted. Now we're going to do the candy onions. And I do recommend always labeling what you're planting, where you're planting it. It's just going to come in handy if you're doing multiple different things. Trust me on that one. So for the candy onions, we're going to go ahead and do this from seed. You can get onion seeds and onion sets at your local feed store, or you can order them online. I get most of my stuff from the local feed store that I manage, and I also get some other stuff that we aren't able to get from Harris Seeds. And they have a really great website. They can ship right to you, so I highly recommend that if your local feed store doesn't have what you're looking for, go check out Harris Seeds. So if you're doing them by seed, you want to go about 1/4 inch deep. It doesn't have to be exact, but as close as you can to that. You don't want to plant them too deep, or they won't come up properly. And if you encounter any like clumps of compost or soil that are a little hard, make sure you break them up, because you don't want that to get in the way and stunt the growth. Now we're just going to gently cover them up. You want to start your onions early spring. And if you want, you can even start them from seed inside and then transplant them outside. That way you have an early start. I have some that I started inside, and these are also candy onions. So I'm going to go ahead and put them into the raised bed. And then go ahead and gently water them in. You want to keep your soil moist, but you don't want to have it soaking. For example, if your soil is retaining the water really, really well, don't feel the need to water it every single day. Wait until it starts to dry out a little bit, because you don't want them to get rotten and mushy and gross under there. But you don't want them to completely dry out either. Just make sure you keep an eye on that, because if they completely dry out, they're not going to grow properly and they won't be able to absorb all the rich nutrients in the soil that we put in. And then just a quick tip, which I did not do it this time, but I normally do it this way, and it would probably be helpful for you. If your soil is really dry, like mine is right now, you could actually water it down first. That way it'll be less dusty for you, and it might be a little bit easier to get the plants in there. Just do whatever works for you, but just a suggestion. All right, so now we're going to move on to the beets. The beets are kind of similar to growing onions. There's a bunch of different varieties of beets out there. I went with the red and with some golden beets. I actually like the golden beets a little bit more. I think the flavor is just a little bit better, but that's just me personally. I recommend that you try planting both and see which ones you like better. Beets usually take about 58 days to mature, so luckily it does not take that long. You plant these early spring, just like the onions. And it works best if you do them in raised beds. That way you can avoid the risk of them hitting any rocks and having deformities as they grow. Just like onions, beets are also very heavy feeders, so they appreciate a lot of compost. I use 19 fertilizer for them. And I also throw in a little bit of bone meal and blood meal for the same reasons we talked about earlier with the onions. Here's what the beet seeds look like. I think they're kind of cool looking. You want to plant these about 1/4 inch deep. Keep the soil moist, but not saturated. And I keep them just a few inches apart. And you can go back and thin them out once they sprout. Keep dropping them. And when you thin them out, you can actually put the little sprouts that you don't need if you end up having too many come up in your salad, or you can feed it to your chickens if you have chickens. And beets are great because you can eat the leaves. The leaves are really healthy for you, just like the beet itself. You can eat them roasted with olive oil and salt and pepper. I really like it that way. Or you can pickle them. There's a lot of different ways you can enjoy it. You can eat them plain. You can put them in a salad, and they're so good for you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get everything watered down, and then we'll check back in about a week once things start to sprout.